Unbeknownst to the children in this small town, the building of a community swimming pool had already started before my NDE. This was probably in part because of all those who were meeting their fate in the river, mostly at a spot called Casey's Pond. I remember driving past Casey's Pond and seeing the children swinging out to the middle of the pond on a rope. Although I was fascinated seeing them as we'd drive by, I really never had an urge to be around the water. Instead, being the tomboy that I was only interested in building a fort. After all, Weyerhaeuser had already built the floor by laying down log ties. All we had to do was build the walls and the roof. Yes, little minds have big ideas that can often be impractical and sometimes even fatal. There are only 2 people alive who were told about what had happened to me. My friends' mothers were nurses at the hospital when I had arrived at the hospital. I know about the one because of the class Facebook page, and I made it a point to have lunch with the other one about 10 years or so ago, although I don't remember how I found her now. The mothers worked at the only hospital in town with my mother and had to cover for my mother because her daughter had fallen into the river. These women at the hospital were all very close, with 2 of them were sisters-in-law. Another nurse and my mother had actually attended a girls' boarding school together, so there were previous connections with some of these ladies long before working together at the hospital. All of these women also had children my age, which meant that they knew that only one of the children between them had ever been in water deeper than a bathtub. They knew that it could have been any one of them who was suddenly being called home to handle their child's near drowning. As far as my mother was aware, I was out horseback riding. But in reality, Linda's father had taken the horses away, telling us children that the horses needed to rest and that we needed to go find something else to do. Linda's father was dealing with me. I should have drowned, but didn't. He was so scared that he left me standing out in the yard, in sopping wet clothes. He put all the other children in the house, closed the door, and waited for my mother to arrive. Mother was driving up the hill and around the curve. The door suddenly flew open, and Linda's father sprinted out across the yard to meet her before she could step out of the car. They stood alongside of the car, staring at me from across the yard while he tried to tell my mother what little he knew. He was talking out of the side of his mouth, pretending they were discussing nothing out of the ordinary. As it was, the other children could explain how I fell into the river, but not how I got out there. Unlike Linda's father, I remember my mother appearing very calm, cool, and collected. But I knew that wasn't really the case. She was a great mother who had a tough love approach to child rearing and who didn't put up with any nonsense. She never disciplined me in front of other people. I remember thinking, am I going to get it on the way home and maybe even a spanking once there? I knew that this was really, really serious. When Linda's father and my mom were done talking, she called me to the car and off we went. Driving down that long hill, my mother said nothing at all. I decided it was best for me to start the conversation to get it over with. Staring straight ahead and down at the floor, I started the conversation. Through tears, I told her that I was sorry. I only wanted to build a fort. I won't go out on those logs again, I promise, etc., etc. Nothing. My mother didn't respond, so I continued. Still nothing. Finally, curiosity got to me, and I looked over to see what my mother was so preoccupied with that she couldn't take care of business. That's when I realized that I didn't shut up and quit distracting her, that there was a good chance that we might run off the road on this steep hill and end up in the trees and both be dead. I was old enough to realize that my mother's face was so full of tears that she couldn't even see to drive. I was still too young to realize that she didn't want me to know how shaken up she was. She wasn't talking because she couldn't, not without her voice cracking, revealing that she was crying. I was also too young to realize that my mother had plenty of time to look at the river and agonize over my experience. She could visualize me choking, gagging, getting water up my nose, in my mouth, struggling to get some air, and etc. But none of that had actually happened, which was why I was so willing to forget the whole experience and just go back to riding horses. All was quiet the rest of the way home. I was thinking that my mother, who gave me the only 2 spankings I'd ever had, was actually going to have my stepfather deal with this situation. This would be my first spanking from him. My stepfather arrived home that night, and nothing was said about what happened that day. No adult had ever asked me how I got from the middle of the river back to the logs, or how did I ever end up back on those huge logs that I'd fallen off of. It was about 4 years later when the next miracle would happen, but even so, it'd be many, many years before I'd finally realize why Linda's father was acting so strange that day. While everything had appeared perfectly normal to me, I was just a child back then. Maybe I had missed the miracle of being moved from where I'd landed in the river and back to the logs I'd fallen off of. Maybe I also missed the miracle of being picked up by the seat of my pants and thrown back onto the logs. But I didn't miss the miracle of talking underwater. And I knew who was talking to me underwater that day simply because I'd been in catechism classes and I was aware of who God was because he could perform miracles. Therefore, I reasoned that I knew who was talking to me. My thinking was that falling into the river was an emergency. But God just doesn't show up for no good reason to talk to people. So there was no reason for Linda's father to separate me from the other children and leave me standing sopping wet out in the yard until my mother arrived. Lynn's father, on the other hand, immediately knew that the only one who could swim was my faithful dog who followed me everywhere. While the dog may have been perched on the edge of the logs, ready to follow me into the river, the dog didn't pull me from the middle of the river and back onto the logs I'd fallen off of. In Linda's father's mind, if God pulled that child out of the river and put her back up on the logs she'd fallen off of, then maybe, just maybe, he's not done with her. Maybe he's going to come back. Just in case, he had cleared everybody out of the way to give me plenty of room. He wanted to make sure no one got in the way until my mother could arrive and take over, just in case. That was the real reason my mother had to come home immediately. She went to relieve Frank because he didn't know what to do or how to handle this. He only knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep the other children in the house for the rest of the day and have me standing out in the yard. Over the years, I would periodically think back on this. How crazy could Linda's father be? He was an adult after all. This whole idea of God coming back to talk to a child was almost as crazy as me thinking that us children could build a fort out of the Weyerhaeuser log ties. A child drowning is an emergency. That's one thing. But God doesn't just show up out of the blue to talk to people. However, as it turned out, Linda's father had been right all along. Having a good 40-plus years on me and being much wiser, he had immediately recognized that they should have been dragging the river for a body. He knew something was not right with this picture. Me, on the other hand, even as an adult in later years, never made the connection from A to B to C until I was forced to do so. I actually had to go back and connect life-saving miracle number 1 and number 2 with, and number 3, and everything that had been happening in between. I guess when you have this heavenly experience at such a young age, you just get so comfortable with God coming in and out of your life, you think something along these lines is going on with everybody. Exactly what Linda's father had suspected was true. 4 years later, the voice was back. 3 different doctors were trying to figure out why was I suddenly had gone unconscious, crashing face first into floor. It would be another 40-plus years beyond that when I would find the voice had actually changed. There would be no more talking to me during the day, and likewise, no more crashing to the floor as if I'd been shot in the back. Unlike all the years before, in January of 1998, I found that now I would be sound asleep in my bed, and whatever I was told also had to be documented in writing. This turn of events absolutely got my attention, getting me to refocus on what was going on in the world. It was obvious that this situation was no longer focused on private matters. This was no longer just about me, and for all intents and purposes, I realized that it never really was. Amongst other revelations, this led to the answer the doctors could never come up with: why I had been crashing face first to the floor for over 40 years every time the voice spoke to me. This scenario could be classified as one of those secrets or mysteries mentioned so often in the Bible, as the answer to this is certainly not where one would expect to find it. And, like everything else, while the doctors could not figure out what I'd been dealing with, it turns out they had literally been brought into the picture for no other reason than professional documentation of their 3 written reports, because It appears that's how God works. Just as in the days of the Bible, everything with God has to be in writing, which only makes sense. After all, if he said, "Those who want to find me will search for me," how else would we connect the dots, unless there's some sort of a written trail to follow? Today we have many NDEs to explore, with more doctors and scientists joining in and giving the NDEs scientific credibility. And while most in the general population are only too aware of how the devil uses the internet, more and more people are beginning to learn, and so too does God. Are the days of the computer just a coincidence? No. Just as there is no time element with God, there is also no such thing as a coincidence. It is only an explanation waiting to happen. Making computers available to the general public in our day, God has now opened everything up, giving the whole world access to his written trails. That does it for today's video. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment below.